Ladies and gentlemen, in life we often face situations where we feel surrounded by opposition, challenges, and adversaries. It may seem like every step forward is met with resistance and every victory is hard won. But in the midst of these struggles, God has a way of working that's different from how the world operates. He doesn't just remove us from our enemies or shield us from trouble. Instead, he often works in the very midst of our enemies to show his power, strength, and authority. This is where Psalm 23:05 comes into play. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This verse speaks to something profound, God's ability to set up a victory in the middle of our battles. The image of preparing a table before us while we are surrounded by enemies is a powerful one. Think about it. When you prepare a table, it's for a time of fellowship, celebration, and rest. A table is where food is laid out, where we can nourish our bodies and find comfort. It's a space of abundance and peace. But what makes this scene so extraordinary is the fact that God sets this table in the presence of our enemies. If you've ever felt surrounded by people or circumstances that have tried to undermine you, you can probably relate to the tension this verse conveys. Imagine trying to sit down for a peaceful meal while people are actively working against you. It seems impossible, right? Yet that's exactly the promise God makes in Psalm 23. While the world may expect us to be defeated, God promises to prepare a table for us. This doesn't mean that the enemy's presence will be eliminated, nor does it imply that life will be free from difficulty. Instead, it signifies that God has the power to elevate us, to provide for us, and to bless us even in the face of opposition. When God prepares a table before us, it's not just about physical provision. It's about spiritual provision too. God's presence becomes our nourishment. His peace becomes our comfort, and his power becomes our protection. The table is not just a place to eat. It's a place to receive everything we need to thrive in the middle of adversity. God's ability to set a table in the presence of our enemies also speaks to his authority over the very forces that try to tear us down. Our enemies might be people who gossip about us, schemes that threaten our success, or circumstances that seem to drain us of hope. But God is not intimidated by these things. In fact, he uses them to show his glory and strength. While the enemy might try to get us to focus on fear, doubt, or failure, God redirects our attention to his provision and power. There's something deeply reassuring about knowing that God is actively preparing a space for us to thrive, even when the world is trying to push us down. When we feel attacked, misunderstood, or isolated, it's easy to become consumed with the presence of our enemies. We can become so focused on the threats and challenges around us that we forget that God is still at work, making provision for us in the midst of it all. The enemies may surround us, but they do not determine our outcome. God does. One of the most beautiful aspects of this verse is that God prepares the table in the presence of our enemies, not in spite of them, but in their presence. It is as if God is saying, look at what I can do despite your circumstances. Look at how I can take what was meant to destroy you and turn it into a testimony of my greatness. This is the heart of the gospel. God's ability to redeem, restore, and bless even in the midst of chaos. He takes what the enemy intended for evil and transforms it into something that works for our good and his glory. When we face opposition, it's natural to want to escape, to hide, or to wish the trouble would simply go away. But God does not always remove the enemy. Sometimes he allows us to face opposition so that we can experience his provision in deeper ways. When we rely on him in the midst of our struggles, we come to know him more intimately. We experience his peace in ways that we couldn't if everything were easy and comfortable. The enemies may be present, but so is God's power, his faithfulness, and his grace. This is the essence of spiritual maturity, the ability to sit down at the table God has prepared for us, even when the enemies are nearby, knowing that they do not have the final say. The challenges we face are not the end of our story. In fact, they are often the very setting in which God reveals himself most powerfully. And as we feast at the table he has set before us, we can be assured that the presence of our enemies is not a sign of defeat, but a sign that God is about to demonstrate his victory on our behalf. God's ability to prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies is a reminder that as his children, we are not defined by the challenges we face. We are defined by his provision, his protection, and his presence. The enemies that surround us may try to steal our peace or cause us to doubt, but they cannot take away the abundance that God offers at his table. And as we sit there nourished by his goodness, we find strength to continue on, knowing that God is with us and he will never allow our enemies to have the final word. When we talk about God's power overcoming all opposition, we are acknowledging a truth that is deeply rooted in Scripture and foundational to the Christian faith. It's easy to believe in God's power when everything is going smoothly, when life feels secure, and when the road ahead seems clear. But the true test of God's power becomes evident when we face challenges, when we encounter opposition that feels insurmountable, when the voices of doubt and fear are loudest, and when the weight of the world seems to be pressing down on us. It's in these moments when we are surrounded by opposition that we have the opportunity to witness God's power in its most magnificent form. Consider the many times in Scripture when God demonstrated his power over opposition. One of the most striking examples is found in the story of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. For years, God's people were enslaved under harsh conditions, oppressed by Pharaoh and his army. It seemed as if the Israelites would never be free. The opposition was overwhelming, but when God decided it was time for his people to be set free, no force, whether human or demonic, could stand in his way. Through a series of miraculous signs and wonders, God broke the chains of slavery and led his people out of Egypt, parting the Red Sea so they could escape from Pharaoh's pursuing army. The Israelites were not only delivered, they were delivered in such a way that no one could deny that it was God who had acted on their behalf. The Egyptian army, with all its might and military strength, was utterly powerless against the will of God. This story is a powerful reminder that no matter how formidable the opposition may seem, it is never greater than God's power. When God decides to move on our behalf, nothing can stop him. The enemy may try to intimidate, to threaten, or to destroy, but God is the ultimate authority. His power is supreme, and it will always prevail. Another example of God's power overcoming opposition is found in the life of David, particularly in his battle against Goliath. Goliath, a giant of a man and a warrior, taunted the Israelites for 40 days, mocking their God and challenging them to send out a champion to fight him. The entire Israelite army was paralyzed with fear. But when David, a young shepherd boy, stepped onto the battlefield, he declared with confidence that the battle was the Lord's and that God would deliver Goliath into his hands. Despite Goliath's size, strength, and years of battle experience, David's faith in God's power led him to victory. With a single stone and a sling, David defeated the giant, proving that God's power is not limited by human perception or natural ability. David's victory over Goliath teaches us that God can use the most unlikely instruments to overcome even the greatest opposition. It's not about our own strength or skills. It's about trusting in God's power to work through us. When we face challenges, whether they come in the form of people who stand against us, circumstances that seem overwhelming, or obstacles that seem impossible to overcome, we can rest assured that God's power is greater. Just as he gave David victory over Goliath, he can give us victory over any opposition we face. God's power to overcome opposition is also evident in the life of Jesus Christ. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus faced constant opposition from religious leaders, political authorities, and even his own disciples at times. The ultimate opposition, however, came when he was arrested, tried, and crucified. The powers of darkness seemed to have triumphed. But what appeared to be a defeat for Jesus was in reality the greatest victory the world has ever known. By dying on the cross, Jesus defeated the powers of sin and death, securing salvation for all who would believe in him. And on the third day, he rose from the dead, proving once and for all that death could not hold him, that evil could not conquer him, and that his power was greater than any opposition. The resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate proof that no opposition can stand against God's power. Death itself was powerless before him. And because of his victory, we too share in that victory. As believers, we have access to the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. And that power is more than sufficient to overcome any opposition we face in this life. When we face opposition, whether from people, circumstances, or the spiritual forces of darkness, we must remember that we are not fighting in our own strength. We are fighting in the strength of the one who defeated sin, death, and the grave. The same power that delivered the Israelites from Egypt, that gave David victory over Goliath, and that raised Jesus from the dead, is available to us today. We are more than conquerors through Christ, Romans 8:37, and no weapon formed against us can prosper. God's power to overcome opposition is not just a theological concept or an abstract idea. It is a living, active reality that we can experience in our own lives. When we face challenges, we can stand firm in the knowledge that we are not alone. and that God's power is greater than anything that stands against us. Whether the opposition is great or small, we can trust that God will fight for us, that he will deliver us, and that his power will always prevail. When we talk about God elevating us in front of our enemies, we are discussing a profound principle that speaks to his faithfulness and his ability to demonstrate his power in the midst of opposition. It is a truth that reflects God's sovereign will to use our challenges, adversaries, and struggles as opportunities for his glory to shine through our lives. Often, when we are in the middle of difficult circumstances or facing opposition, it can feel as if we were being defeated or overlooked. We may wonder why God allows us to go through such trials. But the truth is that God has a purpose for everything. And sometimes that purpose includes using the very enemies that come against us to propel us into the next season of his blessing and favor. The idea of God elevating us in front of our enemies is not about personal vengeance or proving others wrong. It's about showing the world his glory and his power. It's about his ability to take what was meant to harm us and turn it into something that brings him honor. When God elevates us, it's not for our own self-promotion, but for his divine purpose to be made known. God often uses our struggles and the people or situations that try to bring us down as platforms for his greatness to be displayed. In the life of Joseph, we see a perfect example of this principle in action. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. It seemed like his life was spiraling downward and his enemies were prevailing over him. But God had a different plan. Through a series of divinely orchestrated events, Joseph was elevated from the prison to the palace, from being a slave to becoming the second in command over all of Egypt. God didn't just elevate Joseph for Joseph's sake. He elevated him so that his purposes could be fulfilled. Joseph's rise to power ultimately allowed him to save his family and many others from famine, all while demonstrating the goodness and faithfulness of God in the face of adversity. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder that God's timing and methods are often different from our own. We may not understand why we go through certain trials, but God sees the bigger picture. When he elevates us, it's always in alignment with his divine plan for our lives. And it often involves using the very opposition we face as a stepping stone to greater things. The enemies who sought to bring Joseph down, his brothers, Potiphar's wife, and even those who falsely imprisoned him, were ultimately used by God to position him for his purpose. Their attempts to destroy him became the very means by which God promoted him. The concept of God elevating us in front of our enemies also speaks to the idea of God's vindication. When people speak ill of us, try to tear us down or work against us, it can be incredibly painful. But the Bible tells us that God will vindicate us in his perfect time. Psalm 37:6 says, he will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun. God doesn't want us to fight for our own reputation or constantly defend ourselves. He wants us to trust him, to be our defender, knowing that he will honor our faithfulness and elevate us at the right time. When God vindicates us, it's a powerful testimony to his justice and faithfulness. It also shows the world that he is in control and that he is the one who has the final say, not our enemies. This principle of elevation is not just about gaining worldly success or recognition. It's about positioning us to fulfill God's purpose in our lives. Sometimes God allows us to experience the opposition and hardships that come with being misunderstood or mistreated because they are part of the process of preparing us for the place he wants to take us. In many ways, the journey through difficulty is one of preparation. It refines our character, deepens our faith, and builds our reliance on God. When we are elevated, it's not just a position of influence or power. It's a position of greater responsibility. God's elevation comes with a purpose to use us for his kingdom and to bring glory to his name. Another example of God elevating someone in the face of opposition is found in the life of Daniel. Daniel was a young man taken into exile in Babylon, where he faced incredible challenges and opposition from those who sought to destroy his faith and influence. Yet Daniel remained faithful to God, and in due time, God elevated him to a position of great influence within the Babylonian kingdom. Even in the face of the lion's den and the plots of his enemies, Daniel trusted God and remained steadfast. God's elevation of Daniel was a public demonstration of his power and faithfulness. And it not only secured Daniel's position, but also served as a testimony to the king and all of Babylon of the one true God's supremacy. God used Daniel's elevation to bring glory to himself and to show that no enemy or plot could stand against his will. In our own lives, God can use the opposition we face to promote us and to elevate us for his purposes. When we encounter enemies, whether in the form of difficult people, challenging circumstances, or spiritual warfare, it's important to remember that God can use these situations to position us for something greater. Instead of focusing on the frustration or injustice of the moment, we must keep our eyes on God's ultimate plan. Trust that he will use the very people or circumstances that seem to be working against us to work in our favor. When God elevates us in front of our enemies, it's a powerful testimony of his sovereignty and his ability to work all things together for our good. Romans 8:28. Ultimately, God's elevation of his people serves as a reminder that his purposes will always prevail. It doesn't matter how loud or powerful our enemies seem, because when God is for us, no one can stand against us. When God elevates us, it's not only a victory for us, but a demonstration of his power for all to see. It's a testament to the fact that no matter how difficult the battle, God is still in control, and he is working on our behalf even when we don't fully understand how or why. When we trust in him, we can be confident that he will elevate us at the right time, in the right way, for his glory. The enemy's goal is often to intimidate, to weaken our resolve, and to cause us to question our worth, our purpose, and our identity. This is one of the enemy's most insidious tactics, making us afraid of what's coming, afraid of what we may have to face, or even afraid of what we have already been through. The enemy uses fear and intimidation to shake our confidence, to make us second guess our choices, and to try to control us through anxiety and doubt. But when we understand the enemy's plan, we can more clearly recognize his schemes and resist the temptation to fall into the trap of fear. The truth is, fear is often the enemy's weapon of choice, because when we are afraid, we are less likely to stand firm in our faith and trust in God's promises. One of the most common ways that the enemy tries to intimidate us is through our circumstances. When life is hard, when things are not going according to plan, and when the obstacles seem overwhelming, fear begins to take root. We start to believe that the challenges we face are insurmountable, that we'll never be able to overcome them, or that we're not equipped to handle what's before us. Fear takes over and we lose sight of God's ability to deliver us. The enemy wants us to focus on the size of our problems, the intensity of our struggles, and the hopelessness of our situation. But when we focus on the size of our God, those problems begin to look smaller in comparison. In the Bible, we see this pattern of intimidation clearly played out in the story of the Israelites as they faced the giant Goliath. For 40 days, Goliath taunted the Israelites, mocking their God and challenging them to send a warrior to fight him. The entire Israelite army was paralyzed by fear. Goliath was big, he was strong, and he had a reputation for being unbeatable. His constant mocking and threats wore down the soldiers' resolve, and they were afraid to take action. Fear had a grip on them, and it seemed as though no one could stand up to this giant. But in the midst of this overwhelming intimidation, a young shepherd named David stepped forward. He wasn't intimidated by Goliath's size or reputation. In fact, he saw Goliath not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a challenge that could be defeated in the name of the Lord. David understood that the battle wasn't about his own strength, nor was it about Goliath's power. It was about God's authority. While the entire army of Israel was paralyzed by fear, David's confidence was rooted in the power of God. He told King Saul that the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear would deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David didn't let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he trusted in the God who had delivered him before, knowing that he would do it again. This story is a powerful reminder that fear is often the enemy's tactic to keep us from stepping into our destiny. Goliath's threats were nothing more than words designed to paralyze the Israelites with fear. But David's trust in God's faithfulness and power made all the difference. David recognized that the intimidation of the enemy was just a distraction from the greater truth. God was with him, and with God on his side, there was no enemy too great to defeat. Fear, when left unchecked, can lead to inaction and paralysis. It can keep us from moving forward in faith, from pursuing our calling, and from stepping into the promises God has for us. The enemy uses fear to convince us that we are unqualified, unworthy, or unable to accomplish what God has called us to do. But the truth is that fear is a lie. It's a lie that says we are too weak, too small, or too insignificant. It's a lie that says we should give up before we even start. And it's a lie that says God's power is not enough to overcome our obstacles. Of these 7, we are reminded that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Fear is not from God. It is not a feeling that we are meant to live with or be controlled by. Instead, God has given us the spirit of power. His power, love, and a sound mind. This means that even in the face of intimidation and opposition, we are equipped with everything we need to stand firm and trust in God's ability to carry us through. We don't have to give in to the lies of fear. We can resist the enemy's tactics by remembering who we are in Christ and the authority we have through him. The enemy doesn't just try to intimidate us with external threats. Sometimes he uses our internal fears to undermine our confidence. Doubt, insecurity, and negative self-talk are often the enemy's tools to create fear from within. He uses these thoughts to convince us that we are not enough, that we don't have what it takes, or that God will not come through for us. These internal fears are just as dangerous as external intimidation, because they can slowly chip away at our faith and our trust in God's promises. In these moments, it is essential to remember that God has already given us victory over fear. We can take every thought captive, 2 Corinthians 10:05, and make it obedient to Christ. When the enemy tries to plant seeds of doubt or insecurity, we can counter those thoughts with the truth of God's word. We are more than conquerors through Christ, Romans 8:37. God has already given us everything we need for life and godliness, 2 Peter 1:03. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens us, Philippians 4:13. These truths are the antidote to fear and intimidation. The key to overcoming the enemy's tactic of intimidation is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. When we focus on him and his power, fear has no room to grow. Just as Peter was able to walk on water when his eyes were on Jesus, we too can rise above the fear and intimidation that threaten to drown us. As we keep our eyes on Jesus, we are reminded that he has already overcome the world. John 16:33, and with him, we are more than capable of overcoming any opposition we face. Ultimately, the enemy's goal to intimidate us is a tactic to prevent us from stepping into God's will. But when we resist fear, stand firm in our faith, and trust in God's power, we show the world and ourselves that fear does not have the final say, God does. And when we walk in the authority he has given us, fear cannot hold us back from the purposes he has set before us. God's ability to bring deliverance from the traps set by our enemies is a testament to his faithfulness and his power to redeem even the most difficult situations. When we find ourselves facing opposition, we often feel as if we are trapped in a corner with no way out. The enemy's schemes may seem insurmountable, and the pressure from every side might feel overwhelming. But the truth is that no matter how well crafted the enemy's plans are, they are never beyond the reach of God's deliverance. God is a master at turning situations around, making a way where there seems to be no way, and bringing us out of the traps the enemy has laid for us. One of the most profound examples of God's deliverance is seen in the life of the prophet Daniel. Daniel was a faithful servant of God who found himself in a perilous situation when King Darius issued an edict that no one could pray to any god or man except for the king himself. This decree was aimed directly at Daniel, who had a consistent practice of praying to God 3 times a day. His enemies, jealous of his position and favor with the king, set a trap to get him arrested. They knew that Daniel would not compromise his faith, and they used his devotion to God as a means to bring him down. Despite the unjust nature of the law, Daniel refused to bow to fear or compromise his faith. He continued to pray, and as a result, he was thrown into the lion's den. The enemies who set the trap for Daniel were confident that he would be devoured by the lions, but they underestimated the power of God to deliver his people. That night, God shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged from the den unharmed. The king, who had been deeply distressed over Daniel's fate, was astonished at the miracle and commanded that those who had falsely accused Daniel be thrown into the den instead. The very trap that had been set for Daniel became the means of judgment for his enemies. His story illustrates an important truth. God is able to turn the schemes of the enemy against him. What the enemy intends for harm, God can use to bring about deliverance and even judgment. Daniel's enemies thought they had outsmarted him, but they had underestimated the power of the God whom Daniel served. God's ability to deliver his people from even the most perilous of traps is a powerful reminder that no matter how dire the circumstances may seem, God is always in control. And he has the ability to work on our behalf. In our own lives, we may not face literal lion's dens, but we encounter situations where it feels as if we are trapped. Whether it's in our jobs, our relationships, our finances, or even our spiritual lives, the enemy often uses circumstances to create a sense of entrapment. He wants us to believe that we are stuck, that we have no way out, and that there is no hope. But the truth is that God has the power to deliver us from every trap the enemy lays for us. His timing and his methods may not always align with our understanding, but we can trust that he will act on our behalf when we call on him in faith. Another example of God's deliverance is found in the story of the Israelites as they were trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptian army. The Israelites were in a seemingly impossible situation. They had fled Egypt under the leadership of Moses, but now they were stuck at the edge of the Red Sea with no way to cross, and the Egyptian army closing in on them. The situation looked hopeless, and the people were filled with fear and doubt. It seemed as if they had been brought to this point only to be destroyed. God had a plan that no one could have imagined. In the face of certain destruction, God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, and he parted the waters creating a path for the Israelites to walk through on dry ground. The Egyptian army, pursuing them with all their might, followed after them, but once the Israelites had crossed safely, God caused the waters to return, drowning the entire army. What appeared to be a trap, a dead end, was actually the very place where God would demonstrate his deliverance in a miraculous way. It's a powerful example of how God is able to deliver us even when the enemy has cornered us and there seems to be no way out. The Israelites were trapped between the sea and the army with no natural means of escape. But God, in his infinite wisdom and power, made a way where there was no way. Sometimes the situations we face may appear to be traps with no possible way out. But we must remember that God's ways are higher than ours, and he has the ability to deliver us from every situation. The same God who parted the Red Sea for the Israelites is the same God who is able to make a way for us. Deliverance from the enemy's traps is also seen in the life of Jesus. Jesus faced intense opposition throughout his ministry, and ultimately he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by crucifixion. The religious leaders, the political authorities, and the forces of darkness all seem to have succeeded in their scheme to rid themselves of Jesus. But what they didn't realize was that they were playing right into God's hands. Jesus' death on the cross was not a defeat. It was God's plan of deliverance for all humanity. Through his death, Jesus defeated the power of sin and death, and through his resurrection, he brought deliverance and hope to all who believe in him. In the same way, the enemy often tries to trap us by using our circumstances, our fears, and our doubts. He wants us to believe that we are beyond God's help, that our situation is too difficult, or that there is no way out. But just as God delivered Jesus from death and brought about a greater purpose through his suffering, he can use our struggles and trials to bring about a greater purpose in our lives. God's deliverance is not always immediate or in the way we expect, but he is faithful to deliver us when we trust in him. Ultimately, God's deliverance from the traps of the enemy is not just about escaping difficult situations. It's about recognizing that God is with us in the midst of our struggles. It's about trusting that he is our refuge and our strength, and that he will provide a way of escape even when we cannot see it. No trap, no snare, no weapon formed against us can prevail when we place our trust in God's ability to deliver us. Our circumstances may change, but God's power to deliver remains the same. The enemy's plans may seem powerful, but God's ability to rescue and redeem is greater still. When we place our trust in him, we can be confident that he will deliver us from every trap set before us. There's a certain power that comes from knowing that God is on our side, especially when we are surrounded by those who wish to harm us. This assurance allows us to stand firm, even when our enemies seem to have the upper hand. when we recognize that God is not only aware of our struggles, but is actively involved in delivering us from them, we can face our enemies with confidence. God's protection and favor over our lives mean that no weapon formed against us will prosper, and no enemy can stand in his presence. This truth doesn't mean we won't face challenges or attacks. Rather, it assures us that God's presence is with us, that he is our refuge, and that he will deliver us from all harm. One of the most powerful expressions of this divine protection is seen in the story of the prophet Elisha. Elisha was a man of God who, through his obedience and faith, became a powerful instrument of God's will. But as with many of God's servants, his ministry was not without opposition. In one particular instant, the king of Aram became frustrated with Elisha because of the prophet's ability to warn the king of Israel about the Arameans' plans. The king of Aram, in his anger, sent a large army to surround the city where Elisha was staying, hoping to capture him. When Elisha's servant saw the army surrounding the city, he was filled with fear. He could not see a way out and was convinced that their situation was hopeless. But Elisha, with calm assurance, responded, "Do not be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." 2 Kings 6:16. Elisha then prayed to God, asking him to open the eyes of his servant. When the servant's eyes were opened, he saw a vast army of angels surrounding the enemy army, ready to fight on their behalf. The servant's fear was replaced by awe and confidence as he realized that God's army was much larger and more powerful than the enemy's. This story highlights the spiritual reality that even when we cannot see it with our natural eyes, God's protection surrounds us at all times. The enemies we face may seem numerous, powerful, and intimidating, but they are no match for the God who fights on our behalf. God's protection is not limited by what we can see or understand. In fact, his protection often works in ways beyond our comprehension. While we may be focused on the physical threats in front of us, God is working in the unseen realm, arranging the protection and deliverance that we need. Just as Elisha's servant couldn't see the heavenly army surrounding them, we often fail to see the countless ways God is protecting us from danger. Moreover, God's favor works in our lives in such a way that he often uses the very enemies and situations that threaten us to bring about his divine purpose. The Apostle Paul provides an example of this in his letter to the Romans when he writes, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" This verse serves as a powerful reminder that as children of God, we are not fighting alone. God is with us, and his favor rests upon us. This truth gives us the strength to face adversity with confidence because we know that God will not allow anything to happen to us that is outside of his will, even when the enemy tries to bring us down. God has the power to turn those very attacks into opportunities for his glory. There are countless examples in Scripture of how God uses his favor to protect and elevate his people in the face of their enemies. Joseph's life is one of the clearest examples of this. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and unjustly thrown into prison. Despite the circumstances, God's favor was on Joseph's life, and he was with him through every trial. God not only protected Joseph from harm, but he ultimately used those same challenges to elevate him to a position of great influence in Egypt. Joseph's story is a powerful testament to how God's favor can turn even the darkest of situations into a platform for his glory. The favor of God is not just a shield against the attacks of the enemy. It is also a source of strength that enables us to endure hardship and remain faithful in the midst of adversity. When we are walking in God's favor, we are equipped with a supernatural strength that allows us to persevere through trials, knowing that God is with us. This favor does not mean that we will never face difficulties or that the enemy will not try to harm us. Rather, it means that God is always present, fighting for us and ensuring that no weapon formed against us will prosper. In the book of Isaiah, we are reminded of God's promise of protection. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. This promise is a powerful reminder that when we are aligned with God's will, nothing the enemy does can harm us in the end. While we may face challenges and opposition, the ultimate victory is already assured because of God's protection. This does not mean that we will be exempt from difficulty, but it does mean that we can face our trials with confidence, knowing that God is fighting for us. God's protection also means that he has already made provision for our needs, even when we don't see the way forward. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert, God provided for them every step of the way, ensuring that they had food, water, and protection from their enemies. In the same way, God provides for us in our daily lives. Even when we don't understand how things will work out, we can trust that God's provision is always enough. He will not leave us without what we need to face the challenges before us. His protection and provision go hand in hand, reminding us that he is both our shield and our source of strength. Furthermore, God's protection and favor are not just for our benefit, they are a testimony to those around us. Just as Elisha's servant witnessed the invisible army of angels surrounding them, the world around us will see the evidence of God's protection in our lives. When we remain steadfast in our faith, trusting that God is with us in every trial, our lives become a powerful testimony of his faithfulness. Those who oppose us may wonder how we remain standing in the face of adversity, and our response should always be to point to God's power, favor, and protection. In every season of life, no matter what enemies we face, we can trust that God's favor will see us through. Whether we are in the midst of a battle or walking through a season of uncertainty, God's protection surrounds us. He is our refuge, our fortress, and our deliverer. And we can take comfort in knowing that his favor will never fail. No matter how strong the enemy may seem, God's favor is greater still. We can walk with confidence, knowing that with God on our side, nothing can stand against us. In every challenge we face, we are reminded that God is not only aware of our struggles, but he is actively working on our behalf to bring us through. Whether the enemy seeks to intimidate, trap, or destroy us, we can be assured that God's power to deliver and protect is greater than anything we encounter. His ability to silence our enemies and provide for us in the midst of adversity is a testimony to his unwavering faithfulness and love. Just as he delivered his people in the past, God continues to fight for us today. From the story of Elisha surrounded by the enemy army to the miraculous deliverance of the Israelites at the Red Sea, God's protection remains steadfast, ensuring that no weapon formed against us can prevail. We may not always see the entire picture, but God's work in the unseen realm is just as real and powerful as what we experience in the natural. When we stand firm in the truth that God is with us, we can face any opposition with confidence. His favor, which goes before us, empowers us to rise above the challenges and trust in his timing and provision. Though the enemy may try to deceive, intimidate, or entrap us, God's plans for our lives are unstoppable. We are not called to fear, but to stand boldly, knowing that he who is for us is greater than those who oppose us. Ultimately, we are called to walk in the victory that God has already secured for us. As we keep our eyes fixed on him, we can confidently declare that our enemies will be silenced, and we will walk in the freedom and peace that only God can provide.